He expected a black-edged letter informing him of her death. He did not expect to return to the crumbling coastal estate where he had sent his sickly bride to find the gates repaired, the chimneys smoking, and the air thick with the scent of salt and industry. He had abandoned a dying woman in a tomb. He returned to find a queen on her throne, ruling a kingdom carved from the sea itself, a woman who now owned half the harbor he had forgotten was his. The solicitor's office was the color of old bones. Dust motes danced like frantic ghosts in the weak London sun that fought its way through the grimy panes of the window, illuminating nothing of consequence, lending no warmth. It was a room designed for the finality of things, for the signing away of lives and fortunes, and Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt its purpose settle over him like a shroud. He was here to sign away a small, inconvenient piece of his own life. He regarded the woman opposite him with an indifference so profound it was a physical presence in the room, another layer of cold on the air. Eleanora Ainsworth. That was her name. It was a name like any other, a collection of sounds that meant nothing to him. She was a distant cousin of a cousin, a name on a list provided by his secretary, a list of suitably well-born, suitably destitute women who might be willing to enter into a marriage that was nothing more than a legal transaction. His father, a man of booming pronouncements and sentimental deathbed notions, had extracted a promise that Alastair would marry, would secure the line. Alastair, whose entire life had been a negation of his own desires in favor of duty to the crown and the Blackwood name, had agreed because it was easier than arguing with a ghost. He had chosen her because the accompanying report described her as of a delicate constitution. It was a polite clinical euphemism for dying. A dying wife was the next best thing to no wife at all. She would get the protection of his name, a dower house, and the decency of a ducal title on her gravestone. He would get a fulfilled promise and the silence he craved. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in the lap of a gray dress, so worn it seemed to have absorbed the color of the city's perpetual gloom. She was pale, a translucent, fragile-looking thing with eyes that were too large and too lucid for her face. They were the color of a winter sky, clear and cold and startlingly intelligent. They were fixed on the heavy mahogany desk between them, not on him. He was grateful for that. He did not want to be seen. He was a signature on a document, a legal entity, not a man. The man had been bled out of him on the battlefields of the continent and in the perfumed, venomous drawing rooms of the court. All that remained was the Duke. A dry, rasping cough broke the suffocating quiet. It was not a dramatic, attention-seeking sound. It was small, tight, and utterly wretched. It shook her slender frame, and she pressed a thin, worn glove to her lips. Her companion, a florid, sweating man who had introduced himself as her cousin Frederick, shot her a look of pure panic, his eyes darting towards Alastair as if expecting him to retract the offer. Alastair felt nothing. Not pity, not irritation. It was merely data, confirmation of the report. The solicitor, a man named Gable, pushed the marriage contract across the polished wood. The whisper of vellum on mahogany was the loudest sound in the room. "Your Grace," the solicitor murmured, his voice oiled with deference. "If you would." Alastair picked up the quill. The ink was black, the color of finality. He signed his name, Alastair Anstruther-Windtown, Duke of Blackwood, with a series of sharp, angry slashes. A signature of impatience. A signature that said, "Let this be done." He did not look at her. He did not need to. She was a problem being solved. He pushed the document and the quill across the desk. Eleanora looked at the contract as if it were a death warrant, which she supposed in a way it was. It was the warrant for the death of Eleanora Ainsworth, orphan and poor relation, and the birth of some titled creature she could not begin to imagine. Her cousin Frederick had wept with gratitude when the Duke's solicitor had called. He had painted it as a miracle, a salvation. She would be a duchess. She would have a great house, servants, security. She would be safe. Eleanora knew she was being sold. She was a consumptive burden, a constant, coughing reminder of his own precarious finances. This was not salvation. It was a genteel, socially acceptable form of disposal. She was being traded, her fading life, for a title that would reflect well on her grasping family. And this Duke, she had stolen a single glance at him when she entered the room. He was tall and broad, dressed in stark, severe black that seemed to absorb the light. His face was carved from granite, all hard planes and grim lines, his eyes the color of slate, empty of all warmth or interest. He looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture. Less than that, a piece of furniture might be useful. She was an obligation to be endured. She felt the familiar tickle in her throat, the precursor to a fit of coughing that would leave her breathless and weak. She fought it down, a silent, desperate battle. Weakness was a currency she could not afford to spend. Not here. Not now. She focused on the document, the elegant, spidery scripted testament to a world of power and privilege she could not comprehend. Her name was already there, typed out, waiting. All that was missing was her consent. Frederick nudged her, a sharp, insistent prod to her ribs. "Eleonora," he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. "Sign it." She picked up the quill. It felt alien in her ink-stained fingers, fingers more accustomed to mending her cousin's shirts or writing letters for his wife. The nib trembled above the paper. She could say no. The word formed in her mind, a small, shocking spark of defiance. She could stand up, walk out of this bone-colored room, and return to the slow, quiet, inevitable decay of her life. At least it would be her own. But to what? A cot in a shared room, the pitying glances, the constant, wearying burden of her own existence. This Duke was offering a different kind of decay. A faster one, perhaps. The report had mentioned a dower house. Sea-Watch, it was called. On the coast. The sea air was supposed to be good for the lungs. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. He was sending her to a place to get well, while clearly banking on the opposite outcome. She looked at his signature. It was a wound on the page. Angry. Impatient. Final. He wanted this over with. He wanted her gone. A strange sense of calm descended over her. If this was to be her fate, a pawn in a game played by men like him and Frederick, then she would at least play her part with dignity. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears or her terror. Her own signature was small, neat, and precise. Eleonora Ainsworth. The last time she would ever write that name. She laid the quill down with a soft click. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at her cousin, whose face was alight with a grotesque, sweating relief. He had sold his sick little bird, and he had gotten a Duke for his troubles. The silence that followed was broken by the Duke rising from his chair. The movement was economical, powerful. "It is done," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It was the first time he had spoken directly, and the sound of it made Eleonora flinch. It was a voice accustomed to command, a voice that did not brook argument. "The carriage is waiting. It will take you to Sea-Watch." He did not say U.S. He said you. He turned to the solicitor. "Gable, see to her allowance. The funds are to be drawn from the dower house accounts. See that my instructions are followed precisely." "Of course, Your Grace." The Duke looked at Eleonora then, for the first time, and his slate-gray eyes held a flicker of something that might have been surprise. Perhaps he had expected her to be weeping, or simpering, or thanking him. She was doing none of those things. She was simply watching him, her gaze as clear and unreadable as a pane of glass. "Madam," he said, the word a cold, formal stone dropped between them. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a bow. It was a dismissal, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet, definitive click, leaving her alone with her new title and the cloying scent of her cousin's triumph. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. She was also, she suspected, a dead woman walking. The journey to Sea-Watch was a descent into a gray, sodden purgatory. The carriage, though well-sprung and bearing the ducal crest on its doors, felt like a cage. For 2 days, they traveled north, then west, the landscape slowly shedding the cultivated softness of the home counties and taking on a wilder, more desolate character. The sky was a lid of bruised pewter pressing down, and a relentless, weeping rain began to fall, turning the roads to a thick, sucking mire. Alistair sat opposite her, a silent, brooding statue in black wool. He had not wanted to make this journey, had intended to send her with an escort, but some perverse, unexamined impulse had compelled him to see the transaction to its conclusion. He needed to see the place again, the place his father had loved, the place Alistair himself had despised since childhood. He needed to lock this particular door and throw away the key. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since leaving London. He had offered her a traveling rug, which she had quietly refused. He had ordered meals at the coaching inns, which she had barely touched. She simply sat, her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, watching the world dissolve into a blur of green and gray. Her stillness unnerved him. It was not the placid stillness of a gentlewoman, but the coiled, watchful stillness of a trapped animal. Several times he heard that dry, contained cough, and each time it was like a nail scratching on slate, a reminder of the bargain, a countdown. He found his mind drifting, as it always did, to more important matters. The instability in France, the king's latest folly, the endless, grinding responsibilities of his title. He was needed in London. He was needed by the government. This was a domestic absurdity, a loose thread from his father's sentimental past that he was now forced to snip. Eleonora felt his impatience like a physical force. It radiated from him, a cold, restless energy that filled the small space of the carriage. She kept her own body rigid, trying to take up as little space as possible, to be as unobtrusive as the luggage strapped to the roof. She watched the landscape change, the rolling hills giving way to stark, wind-scoured moorland. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and wet earth, a smell of decay and endurance. It smelled. She thought of her future. She had spent the journey cataloging her assets. It was a pitifully short list, a title she had no idea how to wield, a small trunk of worn clothes, a body that was actively betraying her, and a mind that was, despite everything, still stubbornly her own. She had been raised on the intellectual scraps from her male cousin's table, had devoured books on history, economics, and agriculture that had been left lying around, considering them far more interesting than the novels and needlepoint deemed suitable for her sex. It was a useless, unfeminine sort of knowledge, but it was hers. On the afternoon of the third day, the carriage began its final, lurching descent. The road became a treacherous track carved into the side of cliff. Through the mist and rain, Eleonora caught her first glimpse of the sea. It was not the placid, sparkling water of paintings. It was a churning, furious expanse of gray-green, capped with angry white foam. It crashed against a shoreline of black, jagged rocks with a sound like the grinding of bones. And there, perched precariously on a headland, was Sea-Watch. Alistair saw it at the same moment, and a low curse escaped his lips. He remembered it from his boyhood summers as a place of light and air, a happy counterpoint to the oppressive grandeur of the family's primary seat. What he saw now was a corpse. The house was a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of gray stone, streaked with black and green from the relentless damp. Several of the chimneys had collapsed. Windows were boarded over like blind eyes. The gardens were a tangled, choking mass of weeds and thorns, and the wind howled around the turrets with a mournful, hungry sound. It did not look like a house. It looked like a rotting tooth in the jaw of the cliff. The carriage clattered into a courtyard slick with moss and drew to a halt. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the wind, the sea, and the drumming of rain on the carriage roof. Alistair finally broke the silence. He did not look at her. He looked at the house. "We are here," he said. The words were flat, devoid of any emotion. A footman, his livery damp and sagging, opened the carriage door, letting in a gust of cold, wet air that smelled of salt and mildew. Alistair stepped out into the mud. He stood there for a moment, his greatcoat flapping around him, a dark, solitary figure against the ruin. Eleonora gathered her courage and followed him. Her thin shoes sank immediately into the mire. The cold, wet shock of it jolted through her, but she did not make a sound. She stood beside him, a small, gray figure in the vast, gray landscape and looked at her new home. The front door creaked open, and a woman appeared, silhouetted against the gloom within. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine, her face a mask of soured disapproval. "This, Eleonora guessed, must be the housekeeper." The Duke's voice cut through the wind. "Mrs. Gable, I have brought the Duchess." The housekeeper's eyes flickered over Eleonora, a swift, dismissive appraisal that took in the worn dress, the pale face, the sheer lack of presence. The assessment was clear. This one would not last the winter. Alistair turned to Eleonora. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his slate-gray eyes were chips of ice. He had a duty to perform, a final, severing act. "This is Sea-Watch," he began, his voice formal, devoid of any feeling. "It is your dower house. The estate accounts will provide for your needs, such as they are. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms." He paused, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, something kind, something human. She was wrong. "Your health is, I am told, delicate," he continued, the words precise and cruel. "The sea air is said to be restorative. Or not." He looked from her to the crumbling house and back again. "This is your place now. You may live or you may die. I have fulfilled my obligation to my father and to you." He did not offer her his hand. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned, his back a rigid wall of black wool, and strode to the fresh horse his man had waiting. He swung himself into the saddle with an easy, practiced grace. Eleonora stood frozen in the rain and the mud, the cold seeping into her bones. She watched him. She watched him gather the reins, his focus already 1,000 miles away, back in the world of men and power and consequence. He did not look back. He spurred the horse, and it cantered out of the courtyard, its hooves splashing through the puddles. Within moments, he had disappeared into the mist, a ghost returning to his own world, leaving her utterly and completely alone in the ruins of hers. The great front door of Sea-Watch stood open behind her like a waiting mouth. The first week was a battle fought in whispers and shadows, a siege conducted by damp and drafts. Mrs. Gable had installed her in what was called the Duchess's suite, a vast, cavernous set of rooms in the West Wing. The title was a mockery. The chamber was a tomb, a place of faded grandeur and active decay. A tapestry depicting a cheerful hunting scene was leprous with mildew, the hunters' faces obscured by spreading black fuzz. The air was thick with the smell of cold ash and something else, a sweet, cloying scent of rot. But the true enemy was the cold. It was a living entity in that room. It crept from the ill-fitting window frames, which rattled with every gust of wind. It radiated from the stone walls, a penetrating, bone-deep chill that no fire seemed to touch. The bed itself was a continent of icy linen, a four-poster monstrosity draped in rotting velvet that felt colder than the air. To lie in it was to feel the life being leached from you. Eleonora's cough, which had been a quiet, discreet companion in London, became a loud, barking tyrant. It tore at her throat and shook her frail body, leaving her breathless and exhausted. Sleep was impossible. She would doze, only to be jolted awake by a fit of coughing or a violent shiver as the dampness of the sheets seeped through her nightdress. Mrs. Gable and the two skeletal maids who comprised the rest of the indoor staff treated her with a chilling, professional indifference. They brought her trays of thin gruel and weak tea. They would build a small, sullen fire in the grate that produced more smoke than heat before quickly dying out. They moved with a slow, resentful languor, their faces set in grim lines. They were waiting. They were all waiting. The house, the staff, the very air itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her to fail, to succumb, to become the ghost they all expected her to be. She knew what they thought. She was another of the Duke's problems, a London fancy to be discarded and forgotten. They had seen things come here to die before, old dogs, broken-down horses. She was no different. Her presence was an inconvenience, a temporary disruption to the slow, quiet process of the estate's own decay. Their loyalty, she understood with a cold clarity, was not to her, the temporary duchess, but to the house itself and to the absent, powerful duke who paid their wages. Section. One night, the storm that had been a constant presence offshore decided to come visiting. It threw itself at the house with a maniacal fury. Rain lashed against the glass like thrown gravel. The wind shrieked and moaned in the chimneys, a chorus of lost souls. The window in her room, the one with the broken latch, was forced open, and the gale tore through the chamber, extinguishing the candles and sending the rotten velvet curtains flying like demented specters. Eleonora huddled in the center of the vast, cold bed, wrapped in every blanket she could find, and felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. The coughing had left her ribs aching, her throat raw. The cold was no longer just around her. It was inside her, a knot of ice in her chest. She could feel the fluid gathering in her lungs. She knew the feeling well. This was how it began. The slide into fever, delirium, and then quiet. He had told her to die. You may live or you may die. It was a choice he had given her, as if it were a matter of will. And in that moment, shivering in the dark, listening to the house being torn apart around her, she understood. He had not just abandoned her to a place. He had abandoned her to a process. This house was his instrument. It was designed to finish the work her own frail body had started. She thought of him, the cold, beautiful, ruthless Duke. He would be in a warm room in London, a glass of brandy in his hand, poring over maps and state papers, utterly oblivious, utterly uncaring. The thought of him receiving the news, a black-edged letter, a quiet report from his solicitor, of her quiet, convenient demise filled her with a sudden, unexpected rage. It was not a grand, theatrical fury. It was a small, hard, white-hot coal igniting in the icy pit of her stomach. She would not die. She would not die here. Not in this room. Not for his convenience. The sheer, bloody-minded insolence of it was a shock, a jolt of energy that was more potent than any medicine. She would not give him the satisfaction. The decision was made. It was not a thought. It was a physical imperative. She threw back the damp, heavy blankets. The cold air hit her skin, and she gasped, but it was a gasp of action, not weakness. She swung her legs out of the bed, her bare feet touching the freezing floorboards. The shock of it traveled up her spine, another jolt of life. She stood, swaying, a pale ghost in a thin nightdress in the heart of the storm. But she was not a ghost yet. She was a living woman. And a living woman did not die in a damp bed in a forgotten wing of a hostile house. A living woman fought. She stopped acting like a dying woman and started acting like a living one. Her first act of rebellion was small but seismic. The next morning, when one of the maids, a sullen girl named Martha, brought her breakfast tray, Eleonora was not in bed. She was standing by the window, fully dressed in her plainest, most practical wool dress, her hair pinned up, her face pale, but set with a new, unsettling resolve. "Your Grace," the girl stammered, startled. "You should be abed. I will not be staying in this room," Eleonora said, her voice raspy but clear. "I want my things moved to the housekeeper's parlor, next to the kitchens." The maid's jaw dropped. The housekeeper's parlor was small, poky, and decidedly not a room for a duchess. But it was in the central block of the house, near the only part that seemed to retain any warmth or life, the great kitchens. "But your Grace, Mrs. Gable, you will inform Mrs. Gable that I require a dry room," Eleonora said, pitching her voice to carry a note of authority she did not feel. "This one is attempting to kill me, and I find I object to it. Move my things." It was a declaration of war. Mrs. Gable appeared moments later, her face a thundercloud of outrage. "Your Grace," she said, the title a weapon, "these rooms are the finest in the house. They have been the Duchess's rooms for 200 years. Then for 200 years, the Duchesses of Blackwood have been fools," Eleonora retorted, the sharpness of her own reply surprising her. "I am cold, I am sick, and I will not spend another night in this mausoleum. The parlor is dry, is it not? It is near the ovens. It will be warm." Mrs. Gable looked as if she had been slapped. "It is not suitable. My survival is suitable, Eleonora said, her gaze unwavering. I'm a duchess here. My orders will be followed. Or you may write to the Duke and explain to him why you allowed his new wife to perish from neglect in the most luxurious room in the house. I am sure he will be most understanding. The threat was a bluff, a wild gamble, but it hit its mark. A flicker of uncertainty, of fear, crossed the housekeeper's face. To defy a duchess was one thing. To be found culpable in her death by the formidable Duke of Blackwood was another entirely. Without another word, Mrs. Gable turned on her heel and stalked away. An hour later, Eleanor's meager trunk and the few belongings she possessed were moved to the small, warm, unremarkable parlor. She had won the first battle. That small victory was the fulcrum on which her world turned. Installed in her new, practical command center, warmed by the distant heat of the ovens and the sheer novelty of being dry, Eleonora began her true reclamation. She did not rest. She worked. She sent for the estate ledgers. Mrs. Gable produced them with ill-concealed resentment, a set of massive, dust-covered tomes that looked as if they had not been opened in a decade. They were disaster. The handwriting grew sloppier and more erratic with each passing year. The numbers a chaotic mess of neglected duties and petty pilfering. But beneath the grime of neglect, Eleonora saw the bones of the estate, and she saw something that made her breath catch. The estate was not just the house and its immediate tangled grounds. The dower rights included vast tracts of the surrounding coastline, the fishing rights for 3 miles offshore, and, most astonishingly, a section of the nearby harbor town of Port Blossom, including a derelict warehouse and 2 crumbling jetties. The Duke had given her a tomb. He had unwittingly handed her the keys to a kingdom. Her strategy was one of brutal pragmatism. The house was bleeding resources. She walked its empty, echoing halls, her footsteps loud in the silence. Room after room of rotting furniture, molding books, and peeling portraits of grim-faced ancestors. It was a museum of decay. She made a decision. "We are closing the wings," she announced to a stunned Mrs. Gable. "All of them. We will live in the central block. The kitchens, the servants' quarters, this parlor, and the small dining room. Board them up. All of them. But the furniture, the art," the housekeeper gasped, horrified. "A damp chair is firewood. A molding painting is trash," Eleonora said flatly. "We cannot heat the whole house, so we will heat a corner of it properly." She went further. She had the one groundsman, a taciturn, wiry man named Thorne with hands like gnarled roots, inventory everything of value that was not actively rotting. Silver that could be polished, furniture that could be saved. And she did the unthinkable. She sold it. A merchant from the nearest large town was summoned. He picked through the ducal cast-offs like a vulture, but he paid in cash. It was not much, but it was enough. With the money, she did not buy fripperies. She bought shingles for the roof over the kitchens. She bought glass for the broken windows in the servants' hall. She bought thick woolen blankets for every bed, including her own. She bought flour and yeast and a side of bacon. The change in the house was slow, then sudden. The smell of mildew began to recede, replaced by the scent of baking bread and hot soup. The servants, who had been subsisting on the same thin gruel as she had, found themselves eating hearty stew. Their rooms were dry for the first time in years. Their resentment began to melt away, replaced by a grudging, then a fierce loyalty. They stopped seeing her as the temporary duchess and started seeing her as the woman who had fixed the roof and filled their bellies. Her authority ceased to be a matter of title and became a matter of fact. Her next target was the land. The ornamental gardens were a lost cause, a romantic tangle of weeds. But behind the kitchens was a walled acre that had once been a vegetable garden. It was choked and overgrown, but the soil was dark and rich. She found Thorne looking at it one morning, a wistful expression on his weathered face. "This used to feed the whole house," he said, his voice rusty with disuse. "Can it again?" she asked. He looked at her pale skin and ink-stained fingers, and a slow smile spread across his face. "With a bit of work, your grace." "Aye, It can't. They became an unlikely team. She, with her books on crop rotation and soil management, gleaned from the abandoned library before it was sealed. He, with his lifetime of practical knowledge. They did not just plant potatoes and cabbages. Eleonora, studying the local climate, ordered seeds for hardy greens, for herbs that would thrive in the salt air. Rosemary, thyme, sage. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where her mind could be quiet, her hands busy in the clean, honest dirt. The physical work, the sun on her back, the fresh air, it was a better tonic than any doctor could have prescribed. Her cough began to ease. A faint touch of color appeared in her cheeks. But the house and the garden were only the beginning. Her true focus, the thing that sparked a fire in her strategic mind, was the harbor. Port Blossom was a sleepy, forgotten place, its fishermen struggling with leaky boats and low prices from the merchants who control the trade. Eleonora walked the crumbling jetties that belonged to her. She watched the tides. She talked to the fishermen, not as a duchess, but as a woman with a proposition. The old system, where they paid a fee to the Duke's estate for fishing rights, was defunct. She offered them a new one. They would pay her no fee. Instead, they would give her a share of their catch. A small share. A fair share. They were suspicious at first, but they were also desperate. They agreed. The first few weeks, she received baskets of glistening mackerel and cod, which she used to supplement the house's larder. But then she took the next step. She used the last of the furniture money to buy salt. Barrels of it. She took over the abandoned, rat-infested warehouse on the dock. With Thorne and two of the stronger fishermen, they patched the roof and scrubbed the floors. She turned it into a processing station. The fish that came in as her share were gutted, salted, and packed into barrels by the wives and daughters of the fishermen. Women she paid a fair wage. Her first shipment of salted cod went out on a coastal schooner, bound for the markets in Bristol. She had used her knowledge of economics, her sharp mind for numbers, to calculate the shipping costs, the market rates, the profit margins. She waited for the letter from her agent in Bristol with an anxiety that was almost physical. When it came, she read it 3 times. It was a success. A modest one, but a success nonetheless. She had turned rotting fish into hard currency. The cycle began. The money from the fish bought more salt, better barrels. It paid for repairs to the fishermen's boats. Better boats meant bigger catches. Bigger catches meant more salted fish, more money. She hired a clerk, a young man with a head for figures, and set him up in a corner of the warehouse. She started keeping her own set of ledgers, the lines neat, the numbers clean and honest. Within a year, the trickle had become a stream. She was no longer just fixing the house. She was rebuilding an entire local economy. The fishermen were prosperous. The town had a new sense of purpose. And the Duchess, their Duchess, was the quiet, sharp-eyed woman in a practical dress who walked the docks as if she owned them, which in a way she now did. One evening, she stood on the headland, looking out not at the angry sea, but at the harbor below. Lights twinkled in the town. The lamps on her jetties glowed steadily. Her warehouse was a hive of activity, preparing for the morning tide. The house behind her was warm, its windows shining, a beacon of light and life against the dark cliffs. The air no longer smelled of decay. It smelled of wood smoke and salt and prosperity. It smelled of home. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs. The air was cold and clean. There was no cough. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, was a man hollowed out by duty. For 18 months, he had been at the heart of the storm, navigating the treacherous currents of a political crisis that threatened to plunge the nation into chaos. He had spent his days in tense negotiations in Whitehall, his nights poring over dispatches and intelligence reports, fueled by black coffee and a burning, wearying sense of responsibility. He had lied, threatened, and maneuvered, using the full weight of his name and influence to hold the fragile government together. He had been ruthless, effective, and entirely miserable. Now it was over. A fragile peace had been brokered. The crisis was averted, and he was utterly, profoundly exhausted. His colleagues spoke of celebration, of retreating to their country estates for the hunting season. Alistair felt no such inclination. The thought of the balls, the parties, the endless, meaningless social rituals of his class filled him with a deep, visceral revulsion. He wanted silence. He wanted an ending. In the depths of his exhaustion, a strange, half-forgotten memory surfaced. A crumbling house on a cliff. A pale, silent woman. A transaction completed. Sea-Watch. He had not thought of her, his inconvenient duchess, more than a handful of times since he had abandoned her there. He had received 2 brief, quarterly reports from his solicitor, Gable. The first had noted, with some surprise, that the new duchess had taken a practical hand in the estate's management, had sold some redundant assets, and had repaired the kitchen roof. Alistair had skimmed it with disinterest. The second report had been more perplexing. It spoke of commercial activities, of fishing rights and salted cod, of the Dower House accounts moving from a significant deficit to a small but startling surplus. It mentioned that the Duchess was in robust health. Alistair had dismissed it as the ramblings of a provincial solicitor bewitched by a woman who could balance a household budget. He had more important things to worry about than salted fish. But now, adrift in his own emptiness, the thought of Sea-Watch returned to him. He did not think of it as a home. He thought of it as a grave, a quiet, remote place where he could entomb himself for a while, away from the demands of the world. He imagined the ruin he had last seen, the wind howling through the empty halls, the pervasive sense of decay. It suited his mood perfectly. He would go and see the final state of his father's folly, perhaps inspect the small, neat gravestone he presumed now stood in the churchyard. The thought brought him no sadness, only a sense of grim, weary completion. He traveled without fanfare, with only his valet and a single groom, pushing his horses hard. As he rode west, the familiar landscape of his duties receded, replaced by the wild, open moorland. The air changed, growing sharp with the promise of the sea. He felt a grim satisfaction. He was riding towards oblivion. He crested the final hill, the one from which he had first seen the ruin of Sea-Watch 18 months ago. He braced himself for the sight of the rotting tooth, the crumbling corpse of the house. He pulled his horse to a sudden halt. He blinked. Something was wrong. The house was still there, a gray silhouette against the bruised evening sky. But it was not the house he remembered. There were no boarded windows. The chimneys, all of them, were intact, and from several, plumes of pale gray smoke rose in steady, unwavering columns, signs of life, of warmth. The gate to the courtyard, which had been hanging off one hinge, now stood straight and proud, and it looked painted. As he rode closer, the changes became more pronounced, more jarring. The tangled wilderness of the gardens had been tamed. The choking weeds had been cleared, the lawns scythed. On the south-facing slope, where there had been only thorns and brambles, there were now neat, terraced rows of vegetables, stark and orderly under the weak sun. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney of what must be a gardener's bothy. He entered the courtyard. The ground was no longer a sea of mud, but packed earth and gravel. The great front door was closed, and it, too, was painted a deep, defiant blue. The brass knocker shone. Alistair dismounted, a profound sense of dislocation settling over him. He felt like a man visiting his own tomb only to find it occupied, and throwing a party. This was not the silence he had sought. This was order, purpose, life. He did not like it. He raised his hand to the gleaming knocker, then hesitated. This was his house, his estate, yet he felt like an intruder. Before he could act, the door swung open. A young maid in a clean, crisp apron looked at him, her eyes wide. She did not curtsy. She did not seem to know who he was. "Yes?" she asked, her tone polite but firm, the question of someone addressing a tradesman. The sheer effrontery of it stunned him into silence. "I am," he began, but the words faltered. Who was he here? From the shadows behind the maid, a familiar figure emerged. Mrs. Gable. She looked different. The sour, pinched look was gone, replaced by an air of brisk, non-nonsense competence. She was still severe, but there was a healthy color in her cheeks. She was, he realized with a shock, wearing a new dress. Her eyes widened in recognition, the first person to show any sign of knowing him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and something he could not quite decipher. It was not the fawning deference he was used to. It was the acknowledgement of a superior, but one who had been absent for a long time. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his own voice sounding hollow in the suddenly tidy hall. The air did not smell of mildew. It smelled of beeswax and baking bread. "I have returned." "So I see," she said. "We were not expecting you." There was no apology in her tone. It was a simple statement of fact. "Clearly," he said, a note of ice creeping into his voice. "Where is she?" He did not need to say her name. Mrs. Gable did not flinch. "The Duchess is in her office." Her office. The term was absurd. "Take me to her." She led him not towards the grand, rotting state rooms of the West Wing, but down a smaller, warmer corridor towards the heart of the house. The floors were polished, the walls clean. They passed an open door, and he glanced in. It was a dining room, but a small, practical one. A table was set for one. "Here, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, stopping before a heavy oak door that he dimly recognized as the entrance to the old, disused library. There was a light from under the door, and the low murmur of voices. Mrs. Gable knocked. "Your Grace? You have a visitor." A voice from within, clear and crisp, replied. "I am busy, Mrs. Gable. Have him wait. Or send him away if he's selling something." Alistair stared at the door. That was not the voice he remembered. The voice he remembered was a whisper, a cough. This voice had the confident, clipped tone of command. Without waiting for the housekeeper's permission, he pushed past her, turned the handle, and strode into the room. The library had been transformed. The moldering books were gone, replaced by neat shelves of ledgers and files. The vast, empty space had been made practical. Desks had been arranged, and in the center of the room, where a decaying reading table had once stood, was a massive table covered in nautical charts and maps of the coastline, weighed down with stones. The room was warm, lit by several oil lamps, and it smelled of old paper, hot ink, and the sea. At the main desk, her back to him, sat a woman. She was speaking to a young man who stood beside her, pointing at a column of figures in a ledger. "No, Miller, that's not right," she was saying. "You have not accounted for the cooperage fees. The cost of the barrels must be amortized over 3 shipments, not one. Do it again." "Yes, Your Grace," the young man said, and scurried away. The woman sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. She was wearing a simple, dark blue dress, practical and unadorned. Her hair was pinned up in a severe but efficient knot. Her fingers were stained with ink. Alistair stood in the doorway, forgotten, unseen. He watched her for a long moment, this stranger in his house. She bent over the desk, her focus absolute. She looked magnificent, not beautiful in the conventional drawing room sense. Her face, when she turned it slightly to the light, was still pale, still thin. But the fragility was gone. It had been replaced by a formidable strength, a palpable aura of competence and authority. He cleared his throat. She did not startle. She simply finished making a note on the paper in front of her, then slowly, deliberately, turned in her chair to face him. Her eyes, those winter sky eyes he dimly remembered, swept over him. They were just as lucid, just as intelligent, but now they held a new light. A cool, assessing light. The light of a general surveying an unexpected obstacle on the battlefield. Alistair felt a strange, unfamiliar prickle of unease. He had faced down prime ministers and assassins without flinching. But the calm, analytical gaze of this woman, his wife, unnerved him. He searched for the words of a duke, the words of a master returning to his domain. All he could find were 2, blunt and accusatory. "You're alive," he said. Eleanora looked at the man standing in the doorway of her office. The Duke of Blackwood. He was just as she remembered him, only more so. Taller, darker, broader. His expensive traveling clothes were road-stained, his face etched with a weariness so profound it seemed carved into the bone. But the arrogance, the innate, unthinking authority, was still there, radiating from him like a chill. He looked at her not as a man looks at his wife, but as a landowner looks at a prize sow that has unexpectedly survived the winter. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. It did not reach her eyes. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her voice cool and even. "I'm sure a letter would have been less trouble." The shock on his face was deeply, profoundly satisfying. He had expected a wraith, a sickbed confession, gratitude. He had not expected sarcasm. He had not expected her. He recovered quickly, his expression hardening into the familiar granite mask. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the ledgers, the maps, the entire, humming enterprise of her survival. "This circus, this," Eleonora said, rising slowly from her chair, "is my office, and you're interrupting my work. We are reconciling the accounts for the Bristol shipment." She moved from behind the desk, and for the first time, he was forced to truly see her. She was no longer the waif in gray. She stood straight, her posture confident. There was a smudge of ink on her cheekbone and a faint scent of rosemary about her. She was not a duchess in the way his mother had been a duchess, all lace and vapid pronouncements. She was something else entirely, something he had no name for. "My house," he said, the word to reassertion of his own reality, "is not a counting house." "Your house was a ruin," she corrected him gently, as one might correct a misbehaving child. "It was a cold, damp, dying thing. I have made it solvent. I have made it warm. I have made it live. You are welcome." The sheer audacity of it left him speechless. He was the Duke of Blackwood. Men trembled when he entered a room. This woman, this nobody he had plucked from obscurity, was lecturing him on household management. "I gave you instructions," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Your allowance was to be drawn from the dower accounts." It was, she agreed. The accounts were, however, in a state of catastrophic neglect. "I rectified the situation. The roof no longer leaks, the staff are fed, and the estate turned a profit. A small one, but a profit nonetheless. You'll find my ledgers are perfectly in order. Miller," she called to the nervous clerk, "bring the Duke the quarterly summaries." "That will not be necessary," Alistair snapped. He felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had come here seeking a tomb, a place of silent decay that would mirror his own soul. He had found a thriving business run by a woman who looked at him as if he were a frivolous interruption. His authority, the bedrock of his entire existence, meant nothing here. It had no purchase. He saw the way the clerk, Miller, looked to her for confirmation before scurrying away. He saw the way Mrs. Gable hovered in the doorway, her expression not one of deference to him, but of fierce, protective loyalty to her. In his own house, he was the outsider. "We need to talk," he said, falling back on the familiar tool of command. "We are talking," she pointed out, "although I confess I am at a disadvantage. You seem to know what you want to talk about. I, on the other hand, have work to do." She picked up a pen from her desk, a clear, deliberate gesture of dismissal. The fire that had been banked in him for months, the cold, controlled anger he used as a weapon in the political arena, began to stir. "Do not play games with me, madam. I'm still the Duke here. This is still my estate." "Is it?" she asked, her voice genuinely curious. She walked over to the great map table. "You own the land, it is true. The deeds are in your name. But do you know the name of the tide that scours the channel on a neap moon? Do you know the price of coopered oak in Bristol versus Liverpool? Do you know that the roof on the east wing will collapse in the next winter storm if the joists are not shored up? I know these things. I know that Mrs. Gable's son has the croup, and that Thorne's hands ache in the damp, and that the Miller boy is clever with numbers, but easily flustered. She looked up from the map and met his eyes. "You own the dirt. I, however, am in charge." It was the most profound challenge he had ever faced. She was not fighting him for power in the way a rival lord might, with whispers and alliances and threats. She was simply stating a fact. He had the title. She had the control. He had abandoned the field, and she had occupied it, fortified it, and built a kingdom on it. He felt a sudden, dizzying urge to simply turn and walk away, to ride back to London and leave her to her salted fish and her ledgers. It would be the easiest thing to do. but something held him there. A thread of unwilling admiration. A spark of profound, unsettling curiosity. And something else, something deeper. A sense of shame. He looked around the warm, bright room, at the evidence of industry and purpose. He looked at her, at the strength in her face, the life in her eyes. He had sent her here to die. He had wished her gone, and she had had the sheer, bloody-minded impertinence to live, and to live well. To thrive not just in spite of him, but in his absence. "I am tired," he said, the words an admission, a crack in the granite facade. "I require a room." Eleonora saw the weariness in him then, the deep, soul-deep exhaustion that went beyond road stain and missed sleep. For a fleeting second, she felt a flicker of something akin to pity. She extinguished it immediately. Pity was a luxury she had never been able to afford. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice crisp, turning to the housekeeper who still hovered at the door. "The Duke requires a room. Put him in the green chamber. See that a fire is lit and that he has brought a meal." The green chamber was in the restored central block. It was clean, dry, and warm. It was also small and unremarkable. It was a guest room. She had just made the Duke of Blackwood a guest in his own house. The days that followed were a cold war fought in the currency of silence and routine. Alistair found himself adrift in a world that had no place for him. The house ran on a rhythm he did not understand, a schedule dictated by tides, market days, and the needs of the kitchen garden. The servants were polite, but distant. They took their orders from the Duchess. The Duke was a curiosity, a ghost from a past era, haunting the edges of their busy lives. He watched her. He could not seem to stop watching her. She rose before the sun, breaking her fast with a cup of tea and a slice of bread, while reviewing the previous day's reports. She spent her mornings in her office, a whirlwind of focused energy, dictating letters, signing off on orders, resolving disputes. In the afternoons, she would walk the estate, her stride long and purposeful, inspecting the gardens, the repaired fences, the new smokehouse they were building near the cliffs. Often, she would ride the single, sturdy mare the stables now possessed down to Port Blossom, disappearing for hours into the bustling, chaotic world of the harbor she commanded. She did not consult him. She did not seek his approval. She did not, it seemed, require his existence in any way. He was superfluous. The realization was as shocking as a bucket of cold sea water to the face. He, who had held the fate of nations in his hands, was irrelevant in this small corner of his own domain. His presence was a disruption to her carefully ordered world. One blustery afternoon, a man on a lathered horse galloped into the courtyard. He was a local landowner, a baronet named Sir Gideon Ashe, whose property bordered the Sea-Watch estate. He was red-faced and furious, brandishing a piece of paper. He stormed into the hall, demanding to see the Duke. Alistair, who had been brooding in the small sitting room Eleonora had pointedly not offered him, came out, grateful for the distraction, for a problem he understood. "Blackwood," Ashe bellowed, foregoing all pleasantries. "Your woman has gone too far. This is an outrage." "My woman?" Alistair asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The Duchess. She's dammed the stream. The Black Creek. It's cut off the water to my lower pastures. My livestock will die. It's theft. It's an act of aggression." Before Alistair could respond, Eleonora appeared at the top of the main staircase. She did not hurry. She descended with a calm, deliberate grace. "Sir Gideon," she said, her voice cool, "I was expecting you, though I had hoped for a more civilized conversation." "Civilized?" the man sputtered. "You've stolen my water." "I have diverted the stream," "Yes," she said calmly. "The Black Creek originates on Sea-Watch land. I have every right to do so. I am building a mill pond. We need a more reliable source of power for the new grist mill." "A grist mill?" Alistair interrupted, bewildered. Eleonora's gaze flickered to him, a brief flash of annoyance. "Yes, it is inefficient to keep shipping our grain to be milled 10 miles away. This is a simple matter of logistics." "It is a matter of my cattle, madam." Ashe roared. "I will see you in court. I have friends, powerful friends." Here, finally, was a language Alistair understood. This was about power, influence, and the law. He stepped forward, ready to take command, to deploy the familiar weapons of his station. Ash, he began, his voice taking on the cold, cutting tone of command that had silenced rooms in Parliament. You will lower your voice in my house. The stream is on my land. Therefore, the water is my water. If my wife, the Duke, is mistaken, Eleonora said, her voice cutting cleanly through his. Both men turned to stare at her. I have not cut off your water, Sir Gideon. I have merely redirected the main flow. If you inspect the dam, you will find a sluice gate. I have diverted precisely 1/3 of the flow to the new pond. 2/3 continues on its original course to your pastures. It is more than sufficient for your needs. I have the flow measurements in my office, if you would care to see them. Ash stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He was a man of bluster and entitlement, not of details and measurements. He was outmaneuvered, and he knew it. Furthermore, Eleonora continued, pressing her advantage, my new mill will be operational by the spring. I will be offering my neighbors a far more competitive rate for milling their grain than the one you currently enjoy. It might be in your best interest to remain on good terms with me. The threat was not veiled. It was a stiletto, sharp, clean, and perfectly placed. Sir Gideon Ash turned a darker shade of red, mumbled something incoherent under his breath, and stormed out of the house, defeated. Silence descended. Alistair stared at Eleonora. He had been about to bring the full weight of the Blackwood dukedom down on the man, to crush him with legal threats and political pressure. She had defeated him with a sluice gate and a business plan. You should have let me handle that, he said, the words sounding weak and foolish even to his own ears. Why? She asked, genuinely curious. It was handled. She turned and began to ascend the stairs. This is not how things are done, he called after her, a note of desperation in his voice. You are a duchess. You do not haggle with provincial baronets over water rights and grist mills. You do not run a shop from my home. She stopped and looked down at him. The height gave her an advantage, and she used it. I am not a duchess in the way you understand the term. I am the proprietor of a business that feeds and clothes 50 people. A business that has turned this forgotten strip of coastline into the most prosperous place for 100 miles. I do not have time for the delicate sensibilities of a world that left me to die in a damp bed. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to design a new sail for the fishing fleet. The current design is inefficient in a northeasterly wind. She disappeared, leaving him alone in the hall, the smell of her victory still hanging in the air. He felt a rage so pure and impotent it almost choked him. Rage at her, for her competence, her insolence, and a deeper, colder rage at himself, for being so completely and utterly useless. The unifying threat, when it came, did not arrive with the bluster of a provincial baronet. It arrived, as all truly serious threats did, in the form of a man in an expensive coat, carrying a leather portfolio and an air of absolute certainty. His name was Josiah Heaton, and he was the chief agent for Lord Ashworth, a man Alistair knew by reputation, a vulture who circled the dying estates of the aristocracy, picking them clean with legal loopholes and leveraged debt. Heaton did not demand. He requested a meeting with the Duke and presented himself in the library, Eleonora's office, with a chilling politeness. Eleonora, sensing the shift in the nature of the conflict, had allowed Alistair to be present. She stood by the map table, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Alistair stood by the fireplace, a silent, brooding sentinel. Your Grace, Heaton began, addressing Alistair, but letting his gaze slide pointedly towards Eleonora. I am here on behalf of my employer, Lord Ashworth. His lordship has recently acquired the charter for the Royal Wester Trading Company, which, as you know, grants him certain exclusive mercantile rights along this stretch of coast. Alistair felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew of these ancient, forgotten charters, relics of a bygone era, occasionally bought and resurrected by ruthless men to serve their own ends. The charter, dating from the reign of King Charles II, Heaton continued, pulling a document from his portfolio. Grants Lord Ashworth's company sole and exclusive rights to the trade of salted fish and other preserved goods in this territory. It seems the Duchess's enterprise is in direct violation of this royal charter. Eleonora did not move, but Alastair saw her hands tighten into fists. "That is a dour estate matter," Alastair said, his voice cold. "It has nothing to do with me." He was testing the waters, playing the part of the detached aristocrat she had accused him of being. "On the contrary, Your Grace," Heaton said with a thin smile. "As the Duchess's husband, you are legally responsible for her commercial debts and legal violations. Lord Ashworth is prepared to be reasonable. He will overlook the past transgressions. All he asks is that the Duchess immediately cease her trading activities and turn over her assets, the warehouse, the jetties, the contracts with the fishermen, to the Royal Western Trading Company as compensation for lost revenue." It was a death sentence. A polite, legal, airtight death sentence for everything she had built. He was not just trying to compete with her. He was trying to erase her. "That is not acceptable," Eleonora said, her voice quiet but ringing with steel. Heaton finally deigned to look at her directly. "Madam, it is not a negotiation. It is the law. Lord Ashworth has friends in the Admiralty and in Parliament. If we are forced to pursue this through legal channels, you will not only lose your business, but the Duke will face significant fines, and your fishermen will find their boats impounded by the revenue cutters for participating in illegal trade. My employer wishes to avoid such unpleasantness." He placed a document on the table. "This is a deed of transfer. His lordship is prepared to offer you a nominal sum for the assets, as a gesture of goodwill. You have until the end of the week to sign it. After that, the matter will be out of my hands." He bowed, a gesture of mocking courtesy, and saw himself out. The silence he left behind was heavy, suffocating. Eleonora walked to the window and stared out at the gray, churning sea. She had fought the house, the weather, the neglect. She had won. But this was a different kind of enemy. This was the world Alastair came from, a world of charters and connections and ruthless men in expensive coats. It was a world where her hard work and practicality meant nothing. "He is right," Alastair said, his voice flat. He had recognized the strategy. It was one he himself had used in the political sphere. A crushing, overwhelming show of force, leaving the opponent with no option but surrender. Eleonora turned from the window. Her face was pale, all the color drained from it, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. "So that is it? I am to simply hand over the livelihoods of this entire town to a man like that, because he has a piece of paper from a dead king." "It is not just a piece of paper," Alastair said, his mind already working, calculating the odds, the political cost of a fight. "Ashworth is a predator. He will have seen to every detail. He will have the backing of the courts. And you?" she shot back, her voice laced with a bitterness that stunned him. "Will you stand by and watch him do it? Is this not your domain? Are you not the Duke? Or does your power only extend to abandoning women and complaining about the quality of the service?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate defiance in her face, and he saw not just a business in peril, but a living thing, a world she had breathed into existence, about to be suffocated. He saw the repaired roofs, the full larders, the faces of the fishermen who now looked at her with a reverence they had never shown him. He saw the neat rows of vegetables on the hillside, a testament to her sheer, stubborn will to make things grow. And he felt a surge of something he had not felt in years. Not the cold calculation of a politician, but the hot, protective rage of a man defending his own. He did not say anything. He simply walked to his small, unremarkable guest room. He opened his travel-worn dispatch case, a case filled with the tools of his trade, stationery, his personal seal, a list of contacts, a cipher key. He had used these things to shape the fate of the country, to serve the abstract notion of the crown. Now, he would use them for something else. He would use them to save a grist mill and a fish salting business. He would use them to save her. He did not sleep. For 2 days and 2 nights, he wrote. Letters flew from Sea Watch on a relay of exhausted horses. A terse, coded message to a powerful friend at the Admiralty, reminding him of a certain favor owed from a past campaign. A carefully worded letter to his solicitor in London, instructing him to begin a deep and intrusive investigation into Lord Ashworth's own finances. A note to the First Lord of the Treasury, a man whose career Alastair had saved, inquiring casually about the renewal of certain government shipping contracts. He did not explain what he was doing to Eleonora. He worked silently, grimly, a terrible engine of power brought to bear on a single point. She watched him, a silent, uncertain spectator to his war. She saw the couriers arriving and departing at all hours. She saw the light burning in his window through the night. She saw the return of the Duke, not the weary ghost who had arrived a week ago, but the formidable, ruthless creature she had first met in the solicitor's office. But this time, his power was not directed at her. It was arrayed, for the first time, on her side. On the morning of the third day, a shaken, pale Josiah Heaton appeared once more at the door. He did not ask for the Duke. He begged for an audience. He was shown into the library. Alastair was there, standing by the fire, stirring a cup of tea. He looked as if he had not slept in a week, but his eyes were clear and sharp. Eleonora stood at her usual place by the map table. "Your Grace," Heaton stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. "There has been a misunderstanding." Alastair took a slow sip of tea. "Has there? Lord Ashworth withdraws his claim," Heaton said, his voice a near whisper. "He wishes to convey his deepest apologies for any inconvenience. The charter, it seems, has been found to be historically interesting but legally dormant. A clerical error." Alastair knew what had happened. The friend at the Admiralty had discovered that Ashworth's ships were not entirely seaworthy, and that his contract for transporting naval supplies were now under review. The First Lord of the Treasury had suddenly remembered other, more loyal, merchants. The solicitor had likely found evidence of tax evasion or some other financial irregularity. Alastair had not fought Ashworth on his chosen battlefield. He had simply burned the entire world around him. "I see," Alastair said. "Then your business here is concluded." "Yes, Your Grace." "Entirely." Heaton backed out of the room, his relief palpable. The door closed. The threat was gone. The quiet that filled the room was different this time. It was not the silence of conflict or of distance. It was the silence of exhaustion, of aftermath. Eleonora looked at Alastair, at the dark circles under his eyes, at the fine tremor of fatigue in his hand as he set the teacup down. He had done it. He had wielded his immense power not for the crown, not for his own gain, but for her, to protect her world. He had seen its value. He had seen her value. She opened her mouth to say something, to thank him, but the words felt small, inadequate. What came out instead was something far more honest, something that cracked the dam of her own formidable control. "I had no contingency for that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My ledgers are balanced. My supply chains are secure. But I had no plan for a man like Ashworth. I was vulnerable. It was a confession of weakness, the first she had ever made to him. It was the most profound expression of trust she could imagine." Alastair looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not a business partner, not a rival, not an inconvenience, but the woman who had stood her ground against the world and nearly won. He felt a sudden, fierce, and entirely unfamiliar urge to protect not just her business, but her. He did not offer pity. He did not offer platitudes. He walked over to the great map table, his eyes scanning the charts she knew so well. "Show me the weak points," he said. "All of them." That night, the library was not a duke's chamber or a duchess's office. It became a war room, a council chamber for two. The fire crackled in the grate, a warm, living heart in the center of the house, pushing back the ever-present coastal damp. The storm that had threatened to tear them apart had passed, leaving behind a strange, clear, and quiet calm. The silence between them was no longer a weapon or a wall, but a shared space, comfortable and productive. Eleonora, her initial vulnerability replaced by her customary pragmatism, unrolled a fresh chart of the coastline. "The weakness was never logistical," she began, her voice regaining its confident cadence. It was political. I can calculate the cost of a barrel of salt to the last farthing, but I cannot calculate the cost of a peer's envy. Alistair stood beside her, his presence no longer an intrusion but a solid, grounding force. He leaned over the table, his shoulder almost brushing hers, his gaze sharp and focused. Ashworth was a symptom, not the disease. There will be others. Your success makes you a target. We need to turn this ad hoc enterprise into a fortress. The words slipped out, small and questioning. He met her gaze, and there was no irony in his eyes, no condescension. Only a frank, startling sincerity. This estate is a Blackwood holding. An attack on it is an attack on my house. I was remiss in my duties as its protector. It was the closest he could come to an apology, a stark admission of his neglect. She accepted it with a slight nod, a gesture of grace that was not lost on him. The conversation shifted, becoming a rapid-fire exchange of expertise. She spoke of tides and shipping lanes, of contracts with fishermen and the fluctuating price of smoked herring. He countered with the arcane language of his own world. Charters, letters patent, parliamentary influence, and the subtle art of leveraging social obligation. Your contracts with the fishermen, he said, tapping a point on the map representing Port Blossom. They are verbal agreements. They are handshake agreements, she corrected, based on mutual trust and shared prosperity. They are stronger than any piece of paper. For them, perhaps. Not for you, he countered. We need to codify them. Create a fishermen's cooperative chartered by the Blackwood estate. Their rights and your shares will be legally protected. It makes them partners, not tenants. Harder for a man like Ashworth to peel them away with promises of a few extra coins. She listened, her mind racing. It was brilliant. It was a move that solidified her position not as a feudal overlord, but as the linchpin of a modern economic entity. It protected her, but it also protected her people. He understood. He actually understood what she was building. As the night wore on, the barriers between them continued to dissolve. He learned the names of her fishermen, the capacities of their boats. She learned the names of the obscure government ministers who controlled maritime law. At one point, reaching for the same ledger, their hands brushed. It was a brief, accidental contact, but it sent a jolt through both of them. It was not a romantic touch, not the stuff of drawing room flirtations. It was grounding, a simple, physical acknowledgement of their shared presence in this small circle of lamplight, two minds working as one. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and the house grew quiet around them. Eleonora, exhausted but exhilarated, felt a yawn escape her. She tried to stifle it, but it was too late. Alistair noticed. He looked at her, at the faint shadows of fatigue that even her iron will could not completely erase. "You are tired," he said. It was not an accusation, but a simple observation. "There is still work to do," she protested, though her body betrayed her. Without a word, he turned and left the room. She watched him go, a familiar pang of uncertainty hitting her. But he returned a few minutes later, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He had gone to the kitchens himself. The Duke of Blackwood, who she was certain had never prepared a beverage in his life, had made tea. He handed one to her. It was terrible. It was strong enough to dissolve a spoon, bitter and stewed. She took a sip and did not let her expression change. "Thank you," she said. He took a sip of his own and winced. "It appears my talents do not extend to the culinary arts." A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that night. "It's the thought that counts, Your Grace." "Alistair," he said, the name dropping into the quiet room. "My name is Alistair." She met his eyes over the rim of her mug. "Eleonora." They drank their dreadful tea in a companionable silence. The partnership had been forged. In the quiet aftermath of the crisis, a truce had been declared, and something new, something that neither of them had a name for yet, had begun to take root in the warm, solid heart of the house she had brought back to life. The new rhythm they established was as steady and reliable as the tides. They worked. They did not talk of the past, of London, of the cold transaction that had brought them together. They talked of the future, of Sea-Watch's future. Their days were a seamless blend of her practical knowledge and his strategic power. Together, they drafted the charter for the Port Blossom Fishermen's Cooperative. He taught her how to word a legal document to be impenetrable. She taught him the difference between a lugger and a schooner. They were a formidable team. When a rival merchant tried to undercut her prices on salt, Alastair penned a single, frostily worded letter to the man's primary investor, who happened to owe Alastair a significant social debt. The problem vanished overnight. When Eleanor determined they could increase the herring catch by using a new type of net she had read about, Alastair used his London contacts to have a prototype delivered in half the time it would have taken her. One crisp autumn morning, they stood on the cliffs, watching the newly christened Duchess Eleonora, the first fishing boat built and financed entirely by the cooperative, put out to sea. It was a proud, sturdy vessel, its sails a brilliant white against the blue sky. The whole of Port Blossom had turned out for the launch. They had cheered for him, the Duke, but they had roared for her, their Duchess. "It's a fine boat," Alastair remarked, the wind whipping his hair. "She's more than a boat," Eleonora said, her eyes on the vessel. "She's a promise that their future is their own." She looked at him, a rare, unguarded warmth in her gaze. "You helped make that possible." Before he could reply, a sound from behind them made them turn. A horse and rider, approaching at a frantic gallop, the animal's coat dark with sweat. Even from a distance, Alastair recognized the livery. A royal courier. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, settled in his stomach. The world, their old world, had found him. The courier slid from his horse, his face pale with exhaustion and the importance of his message. He bowed low, his eyes fixed on Alastair, ignoring Eleonora completely. "Your Grace." An urgent dispatch from the king. He held out a leather tube, sealed with the royal crest. Eleonora's reaction was instantaneous and devastating to watch. The warmth in her face vanished, replaced by a cool, impenetrable mask of formality. Her posture straightened, became rigid. The partner who had stood beside him moments ago was gone, and in her place stood the Duchess of Blackwood, a stranger. She took a half step back, creating a physical distance between them. The fragile, unspoken intimacy of the past weeks shattered like glass. She immediately assumed he would leave. Of course he would. He was the Duke of Blackwood. His duty was to the king, to the nation. Sea-Watch, their partnership, their dreadful tea and shared ledgers. It was an interlude, a pleasant diversion from his real life. He had been a guest here, after all, and now his visit was over. "I will have Mrs. Gable see to your things, Your Grace," she said, her voice clipped, polite, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice she had used with Sir Gideon Ashe. It was the voice of a woman in charge, a woman who had already discounted him from the equation. "You will need a fresh horse. The roads to London will be difficult in this weather." She was preparing to be abandoned again, and she was determined to show him it did not matter. Alastair took the dispatch, the leather cool and familiar in his hand. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of his old life, of the endless, thankless cycle of duty and crisis. He could already imagine the contents. Another squabble in Parliament, another foreign entanglement, another demand for his time, his mind, his soul. He looked at the seal, the symbol of the world that had hollowed him out, that had taught him to view human connection as a liability. Then he looked at Eleonora. He saw the defensive wall she had thrown up, the hurt she was trying so desperately to conceal behind a mask of brisk efficiency. He saw the woman who had fought a house and the sea and the entire world to carve out a place of her own. He saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek from leaning against a fence post, the way the wind tangled in her hair, the fierce, stubborn life that burned in her eyes. He thought of the silent, cold rooms of his London townhouse. He thought of the fawning, fearful faces at court. He thought of the profound, crushing loneliness of his life before he had returned to this place. He had come here seeking a grave. He had found a home. He turned from the courier. He turned from the summons of the king. He looked directly at Eleonora, his gaze steady, unwavering. "My business is here," he said, and with a simple, decisive movement, he walked to the newly built smokehouse, where a low fire was burning to cure the day's catch. He unstoppered the leather tube, slid out the thick, vellum scroll with its looping, important script, and without reading a single word, he dropped it into the flames. The courier gasped. Eleonora stood frozen, her eyes wide. They watched as the wax seal melted like a drop of blood. They watched as the king's command, the call of the old world, curled, blackened, and turned to ash. It was an act of treason. It was an act of liberation. It was a declaration. He turned back to her, the smoke stinging his eyes. The ashes of his former life drifted away on the sea breeze. "This is my home," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer name or contain. He took a step closer to her, closing the distance she had put between them. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to show he was unarmed, that all his old weapons had been burned. "You're my home." The mask on her face did not just crack. It disintegrated. The iron control she had maintained for so long, the formidable defense against a world that had always disappointed her, finally gave way. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She did not sob or weep, but the silent tears were more eloquent than any storm of emotion. They were a surrender. She did not fall into his arms. That was not their way. Instead, she swayed, just slightly, a great fortress finally allowing its foundations to tremble. And he was there. He reached out, and his hand found her arm, not to restrain her, but to steady her. His touch was firm, grounding. The contact was electric, a circuit finally completed. She leaned into the touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was the greatest concession of her life. It was an acceptance. He did not pull her into a passionate embrace. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the wind, his hand on her arm, letting her find her own balance against him. They stood for a long time, the bewildered courier forgotten, the sea stretching out before them, the smoke from the king's letter mingling with the honest, productive smoke from their own chimneys. The story ended there on the cliffside, but it was also a beginning. They were not two separate entities, a duke and his inconvenient duchess, thrown together by fate. They were a partnership, forged in storms and sealed in fire. They were Alistair and Eleonora. Together, they turned back towards the house. Not the crumbling tomb he had left her in, but the warm, vibrant, living entity she had created and that he now chose. It stood against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with light, a promise of warmth against the coming winter. It was a house that was fiercely alive, and in its heart, two people who had been broken and alone had found a way to become completely and finally whole.